I found my son Julian, sitting on the curb outside the glass doors of his own architectural firm. His daughter, Maya, was beside him, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one hand and a small plastic bag of juice in the other. 3 heavy garbage bags, bulging with what looked like hastily packed clothes and a few framed awards, sat at their feet like discarded remnants of a life that had been whole only hours before. When he looked up and saw my black sedan pulling into the driveway, his face didn't just break, it crumbled. The mask of the successful, stoic architect he had spent a decade building was gone, replaced by the raw, naked fear of a man who had been blindsided by his own heart. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "They changed the locks. They said we don't belong here anymore. They said the firm, the house, the accounts, none of it was ever really mine." I looked at my granddaughter, 6 years old, still wearing her school uniform at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, her eyes wide with the confusion she was too young to voice. She didn't understand that her world had been torn apart. She only knew that her father was crying on a curb in the rain. I looked at my son, 35 years old, a man who had designed skyscrapers that touched the clouds, now sitting on the pavement like a piece of street trash. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't offer a hug or a platitude. In my world, emotion is a luxury you can only afford when the battle is won. "Get in the car," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, "and leave the bags. You won't be needing them where we're going." My son had no idea that I already knew everything. He had no idea that I had been sitting in the shadows, watching the spiders spin their web for 18 months, waiting for this exact Tuesday. And he certainly had no idea that what was about to happen would not just get his house back. It would bring a billion-dollar empire to its knees. The drive back to my estate was conducted in a silence so thick it felt like we were underwater. Julian stared out the window at the Boston skyline, watching the steel and glass monuments he had designed slip past him like ghosts. Maya had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the trauma she couldn't name. I kept my eyes on the road. Patience. That was the first lesson I ever learned in the world of high-stakes acquisition. Most people rush to fill silence with noise, with anger, with explanations, with desperate pleas for mercy. But silence is where the strategy lives. Silence is where you hear the things your enemy isn't saying. "He was my partner, Dad." Julian finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Silas wasn't just my father-in-law. He was my mentor. He told me that when I married Elena, I wasn't just joining a family. I was joining a legacy. He said the merger of Vance Architecture and Sterling Global was a merger of souls." I gripped the steering wheel, but I didn't say a word. I remembered that wedding. I remembered the way Silas Sterling had toasted my son, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I remembered the way Elena had looked at the guest list, not at the people, but at their net worth. "The morality clause," Julian continued, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. "Silas called me into the boardroom this morning. He showed me photos. Grainy, distorted photos of me at a casino in Macau. Photos of me signing documents I've never seen. He said I had debased the Sterling brand. He said that under the terms of the merger, my moral turpitude triggered an immediate forfeiture of all assets. Elena, she didn't even look at me. She just handed me the garbage bags and told me Maya deserved a father who wasn't a criminal. I turned onto the long, winding drive that led to my home, a fortress of old money and deep secrets. "Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet cabin of the car, "do you remember the day you told me you were going to marry into the Sterling family? Do you remember what I told you?" Julian looked at me, a memory flickering in his eyes. "You said, never build your house on land you don't own. And you told me I was being cynical." I reminded him. "You told me that love was the foundation. But love, Julian, is a feeling. A contract is a weapon. And Silas Sterling is a man who has spent 40 years sharpening his blade while you were busy drawing pretty pictures." We pulled up to the front of the house. I turned off the engine and finally looked at my son. For 18 months, I have watched them move their pieces. I watched Elena open offshore accounts in your name. I watched Silas gift you projects that were designed to fail so they could drain your personal credit. I watched them build a cage around you, bar by bar, while you were busy being a loyal husband. Julian's breath hitched. You knew they were going to do this, and you let it happen. I let it happen because an enemy who thinks they've already won is an enemy who stops looking behind them. I said, if I had warned you, you would have defended them. You would have told me I was the cold, calculating father who didn't understand modern business. I needed you to see the knife. I needed you to feel the curb under your feet. Because now, Julian, you are the husband and you are the partner. You are a man with nothing left to lose. And that is the most dangerous man on the planet. I opened my door and stepped out into the rain, looking up at the stone walls of my home. Come inside. I have a room set up for Maya. And for you, I have a war room. We aren't going to sue them, Julian. We aren't going to beg for a settlement. By the time I'm done, Silas Sterling won't even own the suit he's wearing to his next board meeting. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you have to understand the Sterling Group. Silas Sterling didn't build things. He consumed them. He was a corporate vulture disguised as a developer. He would find young, brilliant firms with high-value patents, like Julian's, and he would mentor them. He would bring them into the fold, offer them the Sterling name. And then, slowly, he would strip mine their intellectual property until there was nothing left but a shell. 18 months ago, I had sat across from Silas at a charity gala. He had leaned in, smelling of expensive bourbon and arrogance, and said, Thomas, your son is a visionary, but he lacks the killer instinct. Don't worry, though. Between me and Elena, we'll make sure the Vance legacy is well managed. I knew what that meant. Well managed meant stolen. That night, I went home and made a phone call to a man I had known for 30 years. A man who lived in the digital shadows, the kind of person who could find a needle in a global haystack. I told him I wanted a total audit. Not just of the Sterling Group's public filings, but of their private pulses. I wanted to see every text, every wire transfer, every whisper. What he found was a masterpiece of malice. Silas wasn't just trying to take Julian's firm. He was using Julian as a liability sink. The Sterling Group was facing a massive federal investigation into structural failures in their Midwest projects. They needed a fall guy. They needed a name they could tarnish, a person they could point to and say, he was the architect. He was the one who cut the corners. He was the one who was too busy gambling in Macau to check the load-bearing specs. They weren't just taking Julian's money. They were setting him up to take a 20-year prison sentence. I spent those 18 months not in anger, but in preparation. I bought up the debt of the subcontractors. Silas had cheated. I quietly acquired the air rights of the projects Silas was planning to build. I built a financial fortress around the one thing Silas didn't know I had. The original, unmerged patents for the Vance tension system. Julian thought he had signed those over in the merger. What he didn't realize was that I had placed a parental consent lien on those patents when he was 22, a legal technicality that meant he couldn't transfer them without my signature, a signature I never gave. Silas Sterling had just spent $200 million building a skyscraper that used my son's technology, a technology he didn't actually own. As Julian walked into my study that evening, I saw the fire finally starting to light in his eyes. The shock was fading. The realization of the lie was settling in. What do we do first? Julian asked, his voice steady for the first time all day. I sat down at my desk and opened a single leather-bound folder. Inside was a list of names, Silas's investors, his mistress, his dirty bookkeepers, and the man he had hired to fake those photos of my son. First, I said, we let them celebrate. Silas is throwing a victory gala on Friday night to announce the completion of the Sterling Plaza. He thinks he's standing on top of the world. We're going to let him get all the way to the edge before we show him that there's no floor beneath his feet. Julian looked at the names. And Elena, I said, is about to find out that a merger of souls doesn't mean much when the soul you married belongs to a man who has been documenting your every move for 500 days. I leaned back in my chair. the green glow of the computer monitors reflecting in my glasses. Get some sleep, Julian. Tomorrow, the quiet revenge begins. The sun rose over my estate with a cold, clinical indifference, but inside the war room, the atmosphere was electric. Julian hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring at the monitors, watching 18 months of his life being deconstructed into data points and wire transfers. He was no longer the broken man I had found on the curb. He was becoming a student of the shadows. I've been looking at the Sterling Plaza structural filings, Dad, Julian said, his eyes bloodshot, but sharp. Silas accelerated the timeline. They're hosting the gala tonight, but the final safety certifications haven't been signed off by the city. They're using a temporary occupancy permit. He's rushing it because he's desperate for the lease deposits to pay off the Macau lenders. I nodded, pouring a coffee that was as black and bitter as the situation. He's not just desperate, Julian. He's arrogant. He believes that because he owns the city council and has erased you, there is no one left to check his math. He's already started moving the Vance architecture assets into a subsidiary called Sterling Legacy. He's erasing your name from the lobby wall as we speak. Julian gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. So how do we stop the gala? If he gets those dignitaries inside and the press covers the opening, the narrative is set. I'll be the disgraced architect, and he'll be the visionary who finished the job. I smiled a slow, predatory expression. We don't stop the gala. We fund it. I've already sent a supplemental donation to the catering company and the florist. We want the world to be watching when the foundation vanishes. I opened a secure line to Marcus, my lead investigator. Is the Macau link solid? Clear as day, sir. Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker. The man who faked the photos of Julian is a digital specialist named Victor. He was paid $50,000 from a shell company linked to Silas's private casino debt. But here's the kicker. Elena was the one who signed the authorization. She didn't even use a proxy. She thought she was untouchable. Julian flinched at the mention of his wife's name. Why would she be so careless? Because she's a Sterling, I said, leaning back. They don't believe in consequences. They believe in momentum. They think that as long as they are moving forward, the past can't catch them. But the past isn't a shadow, Julian. It's a debt. And I've just bought the collection agency. By noon, the final pieces of the architecture were in place. I had spent the last 6 hours on the phone with the primary investors of the Sterling Plaza. These were men who had known me for decades, men who valued the stability of my word over the flash of Silas's promises. I didn't ask them to pull out. I simply shared a confidential audit of the patent ownership. When they realized the technology anchoring the entire 60-story tower was legally contested, the panic began to ripple through the upper tiers of the city's financial district. Now, I said to Julian, it's time for you to see the woman you married for who she truly is. Marcus, patch in the bedroom feed. Julian's face went pale as a hidden camera feed from the Sterling penthouse flickered onto the screen. It was Elena. She wasn't grieving the loss of her husband or the father of her child. She was standing in front of a mirror, draped in a diamond necklace that had belonged to my late wife, a family heirloom Julian had given her on their 5th anniversary. She was on the phone, laughing. Of course, Silas is happy, she said into the receiver. The liability is gone. We have the patents, we have the credit line, and by tomorrow, Julian Vance will be a footnote in a tragedy. I've already contacted the realtor about the house. We'll list it as soon as the divorce is finalized. Maya, she'll be fine. She'll go to a boarding school in Switzerland. Out of sight, out of mind. Julian turned away from the screen, his chest heaving. The last shred of the man who loved her died in that moment. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look like an architect. He looked like a hunter. The gala starts at 8, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. What's my role? You stay here until 9:15, I instructed. Silas will give his keynote at 9 o'clock. He'll stand on that stage and talk about the Sterling future. He'll invite the mayor to cut the ribbon, and just as he reaches for the scissors, the silent partner, will make an appearance. I handed Julian a tuxedo that had been delivered an hour earlier. Dress. You are no longer the man on the curb. You are the man who owns the air they breathe. As the clock struck 8, the Boston skyline began to glow with the lights of the Sterling Plaza. From my study window, I could see the searchlights sweeping the sky. It looked like a celebration. To Silas, it was a coronation. To Elena, it was a payday. But as I watched the black SUVs pull up to the lobby on the monitors, I saw a different set of vehicles parking 2 blocks away. Unmarked vans, forensic accountants, federal agents from the SEC, and my own team of legal process servers. Julian, I called out. He stepped into the room, looking every bit the Vance heir, tall, sharp, and lethal. Tonight, we don't just take back the firm, I said, checking my watch. We take back the truth. Silas thinks he's built a monument to his greed. Let's go show him that he's actually built his own prison. We walked out to the car. The rain had stopped, leaving the city air crisp and cold. The silence of the night felt like a coiled spring. Silas Sterling had spent 40 years building his empire on the backs of better men, convinced that he was the smartest person in any room. He was about to find out that the room he was in tonight didn't have any exits. The gala was in full swing when we reached the perimeter. The music was loud, the champagne was flowing, and the elite of Boston were basking in the reflected glory of a building that was, legally speaking, a ghost. Wait for my signal, I whispered to Julian as we stepped out of the car near the service entrance. And remember, don't look at the eyes. Look at the foundation. I walked toward the main entrance, the manila envelope tucked firmly under my arm. The security guards recognized me and moved to block the path, but I simply held up a single badge, the badge of the primary creditor for the land lease. They froze. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of marble and glass. Silas was on the mezzanine, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand, holding court. He saw me from across the room, and his smile widened, the smile of a man who thought he was untouchable. Thomas, he shouted over the music, gesturing for me to come up. I didn't think you'd have the stomach for a party tonight. Come join us. There's plenty of room at the top. I didn't smile back. I just started climbing the stairs, one deliberate step at a time. The quiet revenge was no longer a plan. It was an incoming tide. The mezzanine of the Sterling Plaza felt like the deck of a sinking ship, though only I could hear the hull cracking. Silas stood there, flanked by the mayor and a circle of high-net-worth investors, his chest puffed out with the unearned pride of a conqueror. Elena stood by his side, her hand resting on the diamond necklace that belonged to my family, looking down at the crowd as if they were subjects in her kingdom. Thomas, Silas boomed as I reached the top of the stairs, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. I'm glad you could make it. Truly. I know things have been difficult for the Vance family lately. But look around. Your son's sketches, my daughter's management, my vision. This is the future. I stopped exactly 3 feet from him. The music was a dull thrum in the background, but the space between us became a vacuum of absolute silence. It's a beautiful building, Silas, I said, my voice carrying just enough to make the mayor turn his head. It's a shame you built it on a fault line. Silas laughed, a dry, abrasive sound. The geological surveys were perfect, Thomas. Don't be bitter. It doesn't suit a man of your age. I'm not talking about the dirt, Silas. I'm talking about the debt, I replied, pulling a single sheet of paper from my envelope. And the ownership. You see, while you were busy staging photos of my son in Macau, I was busy in a much more boring place, the municipal records office. It turns out that the Vance tension system, the very technology that allows this tower to stand 60 stories high without collapsing, was never part of the merger. Elena stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into slits. That's a lie. Julian signed the transfer papers 18 months ago. I saw him do it. He signed a document, Elena, I said, looking her directly in the eye. But he didn't have the legal authority to execute the transfer. When Julian was 22, I placed a parental consent lien on all his intellectual property as a condition of his trust fund. That lien was never lifted. Legally, Julian cannot sell or transfer those patents without my signature. And I never signed. The color began to drain from Silas's face. He looked at the mayor, then back at me. That's a technicality. My lawyers will bury that in an afternoon. Your lawyers are currently being served with a different set of papers, Silas, I said, checking my watch. It was exactly 9:10 p.m. At 9 p.m., the SEC froze the Sterling Group's primary accounts based on evidence of wire fraud and the fabrication of evidence against a board member. But more importantly, I've spent the last 6 months buying up the distressed debt of your subcontractors. You owe $40 million in back payments, Silas, and as of 5 minutes ago, I am your primary creditor. The room began to murmur. The mayor took a cautious step away from Silas. You think you can take my company? Silas hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. I'll have you out of this lobby in 10 seconds. I don't want your company, Silas. I want the air, I said. This building sits on Parcel 9. The city lease for the surface belongs to you. But the air rights, the space from the 3rd floor to the roof, I bought those through a shell company last year. You are currently hosting a party in my sky, and you're trespassing. This is a joke, Elena snapped, her voice rising in pitch. You're just a bitter old man trying to scare us. Am I asked. I raised my hand and made a small gesture toward the far end of the mezzanine. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open. Julian stepped through. He wasn't the broken man from the curb. He was dressed in a tuxedo that fit him like armor, his jaw set, his eyes cold and unforgiving. Behind him were 4 men in dark suits, federal agents and forensic accountants. The silence that hit the room was absolute. Elena gasped, her hand flying to the diamond necklace. Silas actually stumbled back, his glass of scotch slipping from his hand and shattering on the marble floor. Julian walked straight up to his wife. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with a terrifying, clinical indifference. The real photos were recovered an hour ago, Elena, Julian said, his voice echoing in the hollow lobby. The ones Victor took of you and Silas in the editing suite. The digital trail of the $50,000 wire transfer from your private account to the Macau specialist is currently being printed out at the district attorney's office. Julian, honey, listen, Elena started, her voice trembling. Don't, Julian cut her off. I'm not here for an explanation. I'm here for my daughter's inheritance, and I'm here for my late mother's necklace. He reached out and, with a slow, deliberate motion, unclipped the diamond necklace from her neck. Elena didn't move. She couldn't. She was watching her entire world dissolve in the reflection of the glass walls she thought she owned. Silas turned to the federal agents. This is a private event. You have no right. Actually, Mr. Sterling, one of the agents said, stepping forward and unfolding a warrant. We have every right. We're here to seize the Sterling Group servers and place you under arrest for securities fraud, racketeering, and the systematic embezzlement of pension funds from your construction crews. The dignitaries in the room began to scatter like rats from a burning house. The mayor was already halfway to the exit, his head down, avoiding the cameras of the press who were suddenly pouring through the front doors, press I had invited to cover the event of the year. I stepped closer to Silas, who was now being handcuffed by the agents. He looked older, smaller, as if the weight of the 60 stories above him was finally settling on his shoulders. You said Julian lacked the killer instinct, Silas, I whispered. You were wrong. He just had a better teacher. Julian stood by my side as Silas and Elena were led toward the elevators, not as owners, but as suspects. Elena looked back at Julian one last time, her face a mask of desperation, but he had already turned his back on her. He was looking at the blueprints of the building, his mind already calculating the renovations. The tower is yours, Julian, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Every floor, every beam, every bit of the air. Julian looked up at the glass ceiling, through which the Boston stars were finally visible. It's not enough to own the building, Dad, he said. I'm going to tear his name off the front tonight. "I've already got the crew waiting outside with the chisels," I replied. The searchlights that had been sweeping the Boston sky for the Sterling Gala were now illuminating a much grittier scene. As the black SUVs of the federal agents pulled away with Silas and Elena in the back, a fleet of industrial trucks roared into the plaza. These weren't the caterers or the florists. These were my men. Within minutes, the sound of champagne corks was replaced by the high-pitched whine of grinders and the heavy thud of jackhammers. I stood on the sidewalk with Julian and Maya, who had woken up and was watching the spectacle from the safety of my coat. High above the entrance, the massive, gold-plated letters spelling out Sterling were being unbolted and lowered into the darkness. "Watch closely, Maya," Julian whispered, holding her hand. "Sometimes you have to clear away the old stone to see the truth underneath." The crowd of reporters was still thick, their flashes popping as the last of the board members fled the scene. I stepped toward the microphones, not with the heat of a man seeking fame, but with the cold precision of a man delivering a final audit. "The Sterling Group is no longer an entity," I told the cameras. "As of midnight, Vance Holdings has initiated a total takeover. Every subcontractor who was cheated will be paid in full by sunrise. Every safety violation Silas Sterling ignored will be corrected. And this building," I gestured to the tower of glass and steel, "will be renamed the Maya Vance Plaza. It will stand as a reminder that a foundation built on lies cannot support the weight of the truth." The fallout was swifter than even I had anticipated. By the following morning, Silas Sterling's offshore accounts had been seized, and his legal team had abandoned him when they realized his invincible empire was actually a mountain of debt I had now controlled. Elena, faced with the digital evidence of her fraud, attempted to pin everything on her father, but the paper trail I had spent 18 months documenting was absolute. She wasn't just a participant. She was the architect of the embezzlement. 6 months later, I sat in the new boardroom on the 60th floor. The office was different now, no longer filled with the gaudy gold and velvet of Silas's ego, but with the clean lines and open spaces of Julian's vision. Julian walked in, looking refreshed, the shadow that had hung over him for 3 years finally gone. He dropped a newspaper on my desk. The headline read, "Silas Sterling sentenced to 15 years. Elena Sterling pleads out 7. "It's over, Dad," Julian said, sitting across from me. "The last of the lawsuits were settled this morning. The firm is clean. The legacy is ours." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. From this height, you can see the patterns of the world, the way people move, the way they build, and the way they break. "It was never about the firm, Julian," I said quietly. "It was about the lesson. You spent years believing that if you were loyal to the wrong people, they would eventually become the right people. But a predator doesn't change its nature because you feed it. It just grows larger." Julian nodded, looking at a framed photo on his desk of Maya playing in my backyard. "I used to think you were cold, Dad. I used to think the way you watched everyone was cynical. But I realize now that you weren't watching for a reason to hate them. You were watching for a way to protect us." "The quietest person in the room is the one who sees the exit, Julian," I reminded him. "Never forget the feeling of that curb. Let it keep you sharp. Let it remind you that the only thing you truly own is your integrity. Everything else, the glass, the steel, the money, is just borrowed air." I stood up and grabbed my coat. My work here was done. I had spent 40 years building a life that Silas Sterling tried to dismantle in a weekend, and in the end, I had used his own greed as the shovel to bury him. As we walked out of the lobby, I paused to look at the new plaque near the elevator. It didn't list the awards or the heights of the building. It simply carried a quote from the original Vance Architecture Manifesto. "Strength is not found in the height of the spire, but in the depth of the foundation. Justice isn't always a lightning bolt from the blue. Sometimes, it's just a father who knows how to wait. It's a man who understands that if you give a liar enough rope and a tall enough building, they will eventually find a way to hang themselves from the rafters." I looked at my son, then at my granddaughter, and finally, I looked back at the city. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the streets. The Sterling name was gone, erased from the ledgers and the stone alike. All that remained was the truth, standing tall and silent against the wind. "Come on," I said, putting a hand on Julian's shoulder. "Let's go home. We've got a lot of building to do tomorrow." Thank you for staying until the very end. This story is a testament to the fact that while the wicked may seem to prosper, they are always building on a foundation of sand. If you believe that a father's protection knows no limits and that justice is worth the wait, please subscribe and share this story. Let it be a warning to the predators and a promise to the loyal. The quiet ones are always watching. I'll see you in the next one.